My wife has this thing with our kids where she won't let them say they can't do something unless they put the word yet at the end of that sentence. So if they say, I can't ride a bike, it has to be, I can't ride a bike yet. Or if it's, I don't know how to speak French, it's, I don't know how to speak French yet. So before we get into today's episode, I want to encourage you to not say, my record label isn't breaking even, but to say, my record label isn't breaking even yet. Hello, I'm Scott, and welcome to Other Record Labels. Today, we're going to talk about how record labels break even. And I'm going to put the notes from today's episode at otherrecordlabels.com/break-even, where you can access all of my resources for record labels, not just about revenue, but about everything, including manufacturing, streaming, and royalty accounting, especially royalty accounting. And ironically, the sponsor of today's video is Infinite Catalog. Infinite Catalog are friends of ours. They're an incredible royalty management software platform that helps record labels of all sizes keep track of their royalties, making sure that all of their artists are kept in the loop, making sure their artists get paid on time, and inputting all of the data that comes from DistroKid or CD Baby or 3Tone or SoundCloud or Sound Exchange or Bandcamp, importing all of those numbers automatically and then crunching all the numbers and deciding who is entitled to what. It's really cool. You got to see how it works. Learn more by going to infinitecatalog.com, or if you want a special tour and a discount from us, go to infinitecatalog.com/other record labels. We're going to look at 5 ways that will better help your record label break even. But before we do, I want to stop and pause and say something important, because some of you might be reading this and you might be prone to being a little bit self-deprecating with your label. You might think, well, there's no way I'm going to break even, or that classic joke of how do you make $1 million in the music industry? You start with $2 million. I want to put those aside for a second because I feel like that's not being fair to our artists, and it's actually belittling their art and their music. Let me ask you this question. Do the artists you represent, do they deserve to break even? Is their music good enough to break even? If you don't think so, then why are you in this business? I know breaking even is hard, and we're going to talk about 5 ways to make that a little bit easier, but I just want to challenge you, instead of thinking, we can never break even, or I'm doing this just as a side project, as a hobby, I plan to lose money. I know that might be true in the first couple of months or the first couple of years, but let's go into this with the mindset that we deserve to break even. We deserve to make a profit. We deserve to be good entrepreneurs. No entrepreneur should start a business planning to fail. Now, if you know my story, I did start my record label kind of as a joke, but I think it was to protect myself. I think it was to set my expectations low so that I wasn't disappointed if we didn't make any money. But that put me in a really unfair disadvantage. But more importantly, it was actually a huge disservice to my artists. My artists took their career really serious. They took their music really serious. But I was trying to protect myself, and so I was kind of pretending that this record label thing was just a side project. I didn't plan to quit my day job, but I really should have took it more seriously, because it would have meant taking their art and their music more seriously. Okay, I'm getting off my soapbox, but before we get into this, I just wanted to mention that. Let's look at 5 ways that will help your record label break even. Number 1, creating multiple revenue streams. What are multiple revenue streams? Well, it's pretty simple, right? We think of this big body of water and all the things that flow into that body of water, like little streams and just the water and the moisture flowing through the forest floor. And then, of course, there's big, huge rivers, and there's big lakes that flow into an ocean. That's the analogy about creating multiple revenue streams. And so how do we convert that to being a record label? Well, the big, huge body of water is our annual revenue. And then the multiple revenue streams, whether that's a really huge river like Bandcamp, or it's a tiny little trickle like one sync licensing deal that comes through once a year. This is about diversifying where your income comes from. It's great if 80% comes from streaming platforms. If your artists stream really well, they're on great playlists, and most of your money comes from Spotify. I'm the same way. I like that. But if you get pulled off a playlist, or if Spotify isn't as popular anymore, you need to have some backup streams. It's really healthy if you have 4 equal revenue streams, or maybe you have one revenue stream that makes up half of everything, and then you have 10 different revenue streams that only make up 5% here and there. This diversification is really important. Not just a safety net, but it can increase your overall revenue, because if Bandcamp is doing really well and your streaming sites are doing really well, and then you do live events and that's doing really well as well, Then when you start to pile on top more streams, the body of water just keeps getting bigger. And so that can be things like streaming, sync licensing, merch, production, label services, recording services. I have this Google spreadsheet for my own record label, and I have maybe 20 or 30 little columns. Sometimes it's like a donation is one column. Sometimes it's a Patreon. Sometimes it's YouTube ad revenue. There's all of these little revenue streams that come in from different places. Like you might make lots of sync licensing deals to movies and television, but then you might sell some beats or sell some stems or samples in another column. I know a record label that has a piece of software. They've actually made like a plugin. These multiple revenue streams are the key to you breaking even. Let's move on to number 2. Keeping your expenses low. This is like offense versus defense. How do you win a game? Not only do you score as many goals, and in this analogy, scoring is generating revenue, but you keep as many goals out of your own net as possible. That's defense. And in this case, it's expenses, keeping our expenses low. Expenses are like the other team scoring on us. So keep your expenses as low as possible. That means like holding out on things you think you should be doing. It's like, okay, this is our first release. Should we pay $1,000 for a graphic designer and $1,000 for an amazing world-class photographer and, pay for the absolute best mastering services? Well, maybe not, because now all of a sudden, for a band's very first EP or your record label's very first release, you now have $5,000, $10,000 worth of expenses that you need to recoup. So the album has to make $10,001 just to break even, just to make a profit. On the other hand, and this is something we were really good at starting our record label back in the early days, if we did an album, we recorded everything in-house, we had the artist design the cover or I designed the cover, we kept our expenses low so that by the time we were releasing, we maybe only invested $50, $100, sometimes $500. That means selling 50 CDs at $10 each on release night would break even on the first day that the album is out. That's incredible. So keep your expenses super, super low and you'll find that you'll break even much quicker. Number 3 is amortizing your record label's expenses. Amortizing is the idea of kind of writing off a fixed expense over an extended period of time. Think of things like mixing, recording, session musicians, artwork, photography. These are fixed costs. Those costs don't increase no matter how many records you sell. They stay the same even if that song gets 1 million streams or 1 stream. So when you take those recording mixes and the session musicians and you take away the vocals and you release an instrumental version of the album, there should really be no extra cost in that. Maybe if you don't have access to Pro Tools, then you have to pay an engineer to mute the vocals. But maybe when you're making the album for an extra $50, they can print stems of the album without the vocals. So then down the road, as a way to kind of keep the momentum of the album release going, I do this for every album release, you could release an instrumental version. Of course, it's not going to generate tons of streams, but that's okay because you're amortizing the cost that you've already spent on that album. The same thing can be said for sync licensing. You've already made this 10-song record. If you can find ways to exploit the masters where you're getting sync licensing for songs that have already been written, recorded, mastered, and paid for, then it's basically free money. And that's what it means to amortize your record label's expenses. This might even be for your own in-house use. For example, let's say you buy recording equipment and then you use some of that equipment for free for your artists on your roster, but you also use that recording equipment for local artists and you charge them for it. Or maybe you have a PA system that people rent from you for $20 a weekend. They can rent this for their gigs or for their weddings, but you use it for your label as well. Number 4, and really importantly, learning and iterating how you operate your business. One of the things I haven't mentioned yet in this episode is the power of playing the long game with your record label. It's really hard to break even in the first month. It's really hard to break even in the first year, but it becomes a little bit more manageable and easily done over the long term, over 2 years, 3 years, when you start to have a back catalog that is earning streams and earning sales that can then support what you're doing today. It takes a long time. Sorry, it's tough to hear that. I've been doing this for maybe 13 and a half years. And because of that, I have revenue that comes in monthly for recordings that I did 13 years ago. But part of playing the long game is learning what works. So figure out the things, like measure what you've done, right? Look at your past year or look at the past month and go, oh, that's interesting. We make most of our money from Spotify and we actually don't sell that many CDs. That's interesting to know. Or wow, People in the video game industry really like our music. Maybe we should make more music for video game people. We made t-shirts and everybody seems to like our designs, so let's do more of that. Maybe we even completely shift into being half of an apparel company. Keep an eye on what's working and double down on that. At the same time, look at what's not working. Go to that spreadsheet I talked about for the revenue streams and realize, okay, we've got this Patreon. It's making like $10 a month. Really, nobody's interested in it. We're pumping out all of this free content and it just doesn't seem to be working and it's taking our time. Stop doing it. Stop doing it. But even big things, like maybe you're pressing vinyl. You press 200 records and you only sell 25. That's not great. After a year or two, you've only sold another 10 or 20. Maybe don't do vinyl. Maybe your audience is only digital. Maybe your audience just prefers streaming. Or maybe the opposite. Maybe your streaming numbers are kind of low, but vinyl's doing really well. You've got to measure everything that's happening, look at your analytics, and make some tough decisions. Double down where things are working and eliminate things that aren't. Finally, number 5 is get creative with your record label. Like 95% of the record labels I talk to on our coaching calls and our clarity calls, they're coming at this from the super traditional model. Sign a band, register the label, get a logo, do a first release, pre-release single. That's great. I teach that. I encourage you to do that. That's awesome. But on a rare occasion, I meet someone who's coming at this label idea from a completely unique perspective, and that gets me really excited. Sometimes they want to start a YouTube channel first. Sometimes they're coming at it from the angle of a recording studio primarily. It's these creative ideas that I think give record labels their own unique, unfair advantage. And so wherever you're at now, if you're thinking about starting a record label or if you've had one for a little while and you're trying to figure out how to break even, get a little bit creative. If you're really into cassette tapes, should you be making cassette tapes for other labels? Should you start a YouTube channel teaching people how to do what you do? We had a record label called Joyful Noise on the show. They have a VIP club. People pay a monthly membership or an annual membership to get access to this portal where they get all of their previous releases and all of their upcoming releases. But more importantly than that, they give them access to some really cool stuff. For example, the highest level of this membership, they're allowed to vote on upcoming artists to whether or not those artists will even get signed. That's incredible to hear music and be like, yeah, you should sign this band. That's giving fans incredible access. And that's a really creative idea. Another record label called Refresh Records, they went to like a state fair and like local community events to sell their merch and to sell their records, events where there were no other record labels at, and so they could stand out. That's being super creative. 7 years into my own record label, I decided to take a camera to local recording studios and do these studio tours for YouTube. They became incredibly popular, and like 8 years later, people still watch them. Just an interesting way to kind of meet new people and to elevate my brand. So get creative with your record label. That's a great way to break even because it starts to introduce you into new ideas, eventually new revenue streams or new opportunities to amortize your fixed costs. The point is there's a path for you to be profitable. You maybe just haven't found it yet. The path is out there. Trust me. If it's selling records the traditional way, great. I hope that's true. Maybe you're profitable because you sell a lot of great vinyl, but your streaming numbers suck. Maybe you're profitable because your artists are juggernauts on Spotify, but you can't sell any physical records. Maybe you do a little bit of both. Maybe neither is true and you have something that's super unique that you just haven't discovered yet. I would suggest starting with what you're most passionate about. Are you passionate about networking, live events, starting a YouTube channel? Are you passionate about the format? Is it vinyl? Is it cassettes? Is it bringing CDs back? Are you passionate about the manufacturing process or movies and television? You want to marry that together. There's a record label that only releases the soundtrack from horror films. What an incredible marriage of two passions. I hope you found this helpful. Go to otherrecordlabels.com/breakeven. That's all one word, otherrecordlabels.com/breakeven, where you can get the notes from today's episode, as well as on our website, otherrecordlabels.com. There's tons of free resources for people who are thinking about starting a record label. Or if you're like me and you've had a record label for a couple of years or a dozen years, and you're stuck and you want to improve or iterate and get more creative or break even, go to otherrecordlabels.com to check that out. And once you start bringing in revenue and you need to pay your artists, you need our friends at Infinite Catalog. A huge shout out to them for sponsoring today's episode. And go to infinitecatalog.com to learn more. And go to infinitecatalog.com/otherrecordlabels for a special discount. Thanks for watching.